Thank you, Professor Herrick, for that introduction. And thank you to all for coming to hear me talk today about this poem that I have been thinking about for about 5 years. It's a tricky poem. I've heard it described as one of the top 5 most difficult poems in the English language.
Better. Is that better? Okay. So I was mumbling, I suppose, accidentally, that I've been thinking about this poem for the better part of 5 years, and I've heard it described as among the top 5 most difficult poems in the English language, and I tend to agree. So in order to kind of frame the particular case that I want to make today, I thought I'd begin by saying just a few words about my broader research program. As Professor Herrick mentioned, I'm interested in the relationship between religion and literature, and most specifically, I investigate how literary texts help people mediate or manage frictions, tensions in their religious projects. My research starts with the stories that we tell ourselves about what happened to religion in the 19th century. This is the era in which academia itself came to be understood as a more or less secular institution, when literary studies differentiated itself from biblical hermeneutics, when religion came to be understood as a matter of individual choice and experience. So, what story have scholars typically told about Victorian religion? This tale, at times called, you had a spoiler, the secularization thesis, or sometimes we call this the subtraction story of secularization, was a narrative of decline. I'm going to condense wide swaths of sociological, anthropological, and literary thought. Many major thinkers of the 20th century depicted Victorian religion as something like an endangered species, threatened by the competing forces of geological science, evolutionary theory, and political liberalism. Religion, so the story went, once ruled human thought, experience, and behavior. But the 19th century saw its gradual decline in both public and private influence. Perhaps most famously, Max Weber, in a 1917 lecture, described this process as one of disenchantment. Quote, "The fate of our time is characterized by rationalization and intellectualization, and above all, by the disenchantment of the world." Enlightenment reason, to hear Weber tell it, had robbed the world of its magic, religious and otherwise, rendering it spiritually toothless. While this process was, for Weber, an occasion to be mourned, he did not, it should be noted, celebrate this supposed disenchantment. The process was understood as inevitable. In depicting religious life as woefully threatened, Weber was joined by many of the major intellectual figures of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As Pippa Norris and Ronald Inglehart point out in their book Sacred and Secular, quote, "The seminal social thinkers of the 19th century, Auguste Comte, Herbert Spencer, Emile Durkheim, Max Weber, Karl Marx, and Sigmund Freud all believed that religion would gradually fade in importance and cease to be significant with the advent of industrial society. From a wide variety of disciplinary perspectives and with a range of intellectual priorities, these and other theorists tended to narrate the experience of Victorian religion through metaphors of embattlement, sickness, decline, or extinction. While they were by no means unified in how they understood the process of secularization, they were more or less agreed on the widest possible interpretation of what happened to religion in the 19th century, which is to say, we used to believe, and now we do not. This narrative was thoroughly and cheerfully integrated into literary critics' understandings of the period. In a seminal text, The Disappearance of God, for example, J. Hillis Miller anticipated a moment when, quote, "the old system of symbols binding man to God had finally evaporated." That was in 1963. Similarly, in her foundational study of Darwinian evolution and Victorian narrative, Gillian Beer asserts that fiction, quote, in the second half of the 19th century, was particularly seeking sources of authoritative organization which could substitute for the godlike omnipotence and omniscience open to the theistic creator. Scholars of Victorian literature have tended to pay more attention to religious doubt than to religious complexity, in part because the story of secularization created space for literature, and therefore literary studies, to do ever more important work. For instance, for Christopher Lane, writing just a few years ago, Victorian literature itself tells the story of Victorian doubt by describing what it felt like to lose one's religious faith, as an individual and more broadly as a people and a society. Each of these studies demonstrates the increasingly creative ways in which Victorians constructed meaning when the notion of God as a cohesive organizer of the world was being questioned. Still, these scholars rely strongly on an assumption of God's disappearance, collapsing a series of religious shifts and adaptations into a simpler narrative of God's removal from public Victorian life. There are a variety of problems with this story of secularization, and it would take more time than I have today to enumerate them. Luckily, I don't have to, because my colleagues have already done so. Here are just a few of their insights. Secularist depictions of religious life in Victorian culture underestimated the persistence of religion in individual and public life, overstated the capacity of literature to fill the cultural gap supposedly left by religion, ignored the variety of religious commitments espoused and experimented with in the pages of Victorian literature, and in many ways misrepresented what religion actually is. The first issue with the secularization thesis is that it is not entirely historical. For one thing, collective religious behaviors such as church and lecture attendance rose dramatically over the course of the period, both in England and across Europe and the Americas. Scholars have also questioned the way our traditional notions of secularization operate on a binary. As Talal Assad points out, quote, the categories of politics and religion turn out to implicate each other more profoundly than we thought. The concept of the secular cannot do without the idea of religion. Victorian literary critics have also pointed out quite usefully that the image of an informed secular doubter has typically been limited to well-educated white European men. As I hope to show a little bit today, if we take into account the religious positionalities of people who do not fall into that category, the picture of Victorian religion starts to look quite different. And relatedly, the secularization thesis has typically understood religion merely as an issue of belief, overemphasizing religious doubt and questions about the existence of God as the sole locus of religious experience. And here I should pause and say, when I teach religion and literature in my classes, I try to encourage my students, religion equals belief, belonging, and behavior, among other things. There are a variety of definitions of religion we could choose, but none of them can be limited to the questions of intellectual belief. An implicit assumption of that interpretation was that the process of secularization was one of maturity. Cultures evolved when they grew up out of the childish ways of religion. Read in this way, the 19th century appears as something of an era of cultural adolescence, during which critical thinkers asserted their independence from the old structures of religious institutions. The point of departure for my own scholarly work is this association between religion and immaturity. In my book project, tentatively titled Recursive Hermeneutics and the Victorian Secular Imagination, I explicate sermons, scientific tracts, child-rearing manuals, public lectures, and literary texts in order to trace two cultural narratives about the status of religion in the 19th century. The first I've been hinting at. It was established by Victorian academics, and it understood the 19th century as a time of growth away from religion and towards secularism. These thinkers imagined religion as childish, and they saw academic inquiry as a more mature way of understanding the world. In contrast, I trace a competing cultural narrative articulated in the pages of Victorian literature. By analyzing literary works by Thomas Carlyle, Matthew Arnold, Robert Browning, Christina Rossetti, and George MacDonald, I show how these writers work against the developmentalist account of secularism by embracing seemingly immature forms of knowledge production. In doing so, they produce hybrid forms of religiosity, more capable of accommodating the increasing religious pluralism of a globalizing public sphere. One simple way of describing this project and the scholarly conversation to which I hope it contributes is an effort to, quite simply, think more carefully about religion. In what follows, I'd like to examine religious experience beyond the belief tenets to which one assents in one's own head. And I want to explore whether and how we can recuperate the notion of immaturity as a strategy for doing so. I want to do this by looking at one particular poem, which is, as I've said, Robert Browning's rather brilliant 1864 piece, Caliban upon Setebos, which was illustrated the year after by William Bell Scott right here. Okay, so I should tell you about this complex poem. Like many of Robert Browning's dramatic monologues, this poem showcases the positionality of a highly idiosyncratic speaker. In this case, we have the eponymous Caliban, who is a hybrid figure drawn from Shakespeare's play, The Tempest. So it's sort of an adaptation of that play through the perspective of one character. One of the original inhabitants of an island overtaken by the sorcerer Prospero, Caliban has been forced into slavery largely on the basis of his not quite humanness. The poem takes place during a rare interval of time not dedicated to forced labor. His captors, Prospero and Miranda, enjoy a midday nap, and Caliban takes advantage of their absence and the lack of surveillance in his toil to muse on the nature of his god and on the questionable order of the universe. So he mucks around in his little island habitat. He's getting drunk on pumpkin mash. He's toying with these critters that are skittering all about his body. He's sort of saving some of them and breaking other ones, in this kind of whimsical way. And as he's doing all of this, kind of playing with his surroundings, he's speaking out what he imagines as the traits of his deity. So the poem is often read as a theological exercise. His conclusions, if we can call them conclusions, are grim. He believes in a creator called Setebos, but this deity looks nothing like the Christian God, loving God that many of Browning's readers were wanting to imagine. Capricious and amoral, and often interpreted as an avatar for Prospero, his enslaver, Setebos inspires fear and loathing in Caliban with very few consolations. Caliban anticipates no afterlife, and he isn't too optimistic about relief from suffering in this one. Even as he imagines a second god above Setebos, known as the Quiet, Caliban can't imagine a god who works in his favor. The indifferent Quiet, the sort of super god, although less violent than Setebos, exists as pure will. The line is, all it hath a mind to, it doth. Caliban observes, conjuring a being, he's observing a being devoid of selfhood altogether. So he's got one kind of aggressive, violent, maybe evil god, and then one completely indifferent, almost personless god. And neither one of them are comforting or loving. Okay. So before it even officially begins, the poem announces itself as a poem about belief. Subtitled Natural Theology in the Island, it seems to serve itself up as an occasion to interrogate the belief propositions of one particular creed. Natural theology had enjoyed a vogue in the early 19th century, as thinkers like William Paley in his 1802 treatise, Natural Theology, developed earlier theories advanced by those like Bishop Joseph Butler in The Analogy of Religion, Natural and Revealed, which had appeared way back in 1740. Many of us, though maybe not all of us, I imagine, are familiar with Paley's now famous watchmaker argument that explains the complexities of nature. So the premise is that much like the intricacies of a watch, the complexities of nature verified the existence and providence of God. So we see a watch and we assume a watchmaker is the central kind of premise of Paley's work. In Paley's concise formulation, Contrivance must have had a contriver, design a designer. The project of natural theology was to show that humans could know God by interpreting nature as his handiwork. And while the image of the watch has come to be understood as the hallmark of natural theology, we should also notice a trend in natural theologians' rhetoric. They position science, the science of natural theology, as a kind of interpretation, referring to God, the creator, as the author of creation. These thinkers imagined the process of understanding God as something like close reading the text of the natural world. While natural theology has a long legacy and is much more complex than this brief gloss allows, and while we should be wary of overstating the dichotomy between natural and revealed theology, it's sort of the other side of the coin, I want to emphasize the pattern of natural theological interpretation that seems to structure this particular poem. If design implies a designer, then the observer has only to closely examine the book of nature to interpret truths about God, the natural world, and the order within it. Its dominant logic is analogy. Thus, throughout the poem, Caliban seems to observe the natural world as well as his own behavior, which is part of the natural world. Here he is using his own behavior to create belief statements about his God. I'm going to start the second line, or the third line here. Am strong myself compared to yonder crabs that march now from the mountain to the sea. Let 20 pass and stone the 21st, loving not, hating not, just choosing so. Say the first straggler that boasts purple spots shall join the file, one pincher twisted off. Say this bruised fellow shall receive a worm, and 2 worms he whose nippers end in red. As it likes me each time I do, so he. So what you can see here is he's messing with the crabs with seemingly no logic to what he's doing to them, rewarding them for random physical marcations, or hurting one of them, again, for no reason, then it's bruised. And then this last line, as it likes me each time I do, so he. This is a pattern throughout the poem. Almost every stanza has Caliban observing something about the natural world and engaging with it, and then taking that observation and generalizing it up to his God. Okay. Enacting the anthropomorphic, we'll get there, okay. Enacting the anthropomorphic logic that earned natural theologians such criticism, Caliban ascribes his own traits to his God. The speaker's seemingly primitive perspective and his understanding of his world in social Darwinist terms as a hostile arena seems to invite a fairly basic critique. Browning uses Caliban, so the thought goes, to demonstrate the errors of constructing God in the image of ourselves, rehearsing pseudoscientific evolutionary theories that depicted non-Anglo people as less evolved, evolutionary adolescents, so to speak. This poem invites us to understand Caliban's speech as representing primitive belief, the epistemological declaration of an immature interpreter. Indeed, Caliban's theology has generally been understood to represent naive, misguided, or ill-informed faith, and therefore it's been read as a referendum on Browning's own religious commitments. The poem's epigraph, which comes from Psalm 50, is, "Thou thoughtest I was altogether such a one as thyself." It seems to issue interpretive instructions in this direction. That moment from the Bible shows the Almighty rebuking the Hebrew nation for assuming an analogy between their behavior and his. But if Browning is using Caliban to level a critique in this poem, it's one that is unusually difficult to locate. One reason why, I think, is that this text presents a unique tension between the seemingly primitive speaker and the striking complexity of both the poem's language, which you can see, and its religiosity. As Isabel Armstrong notes, Caliban's thought represents a momentous effort of intellect. I take as a given that the poem demands re-examination in light of 2 lively conversations in Victorian studies. Firstly, the ongoing reckoning with religion, spirituality, and secularism that was engendered by what has been called the religious turn, and which I've described. And secondly, the field's self-examination and push to undiscipline itself, in part by examining the ways our scholarship has itself inscribed and re-inscribed racial hierarchies. These two critical priorities find a locus in Caliban upon Setebos, and I want to think about what Browning is up to by looking differently at the kind of interpretive moves Caliban is making here. In this argument, I'm indebted to Joshua Loisberg, who departs from readings that understand Caliban as merely observing his own cruel or immoral behavior and generalizing cruelty or immorality to his deity. Instead, Loisberg offers us a different way to think about the natural theology in the poem by pointing out that the God Caliban imagines seems very appropriate to his circumstances. In other words, although he doesn't use these words, Loisberg understands Caliban's response as a speech, as a response to the very real questions about theodicy, the problem of evil, amplified by the conditions of slavery. This is a quote: weighing the question of whether the world is in the grip of an unjust deity or simply works as it does without justification gives Caliban the opportunity to meditate on the status of his enslavement as natural or unjust, as a thing to be resisted or an inescapable natural condition. Put simply, Caliban isn't misinterpreting the natural world. He's proposing an altogether reasonable explanation for the injustice and violence of his enslavement. For my part, I second Loisberg's assertion that Caliban's theology presents an appropriate response to his circumstances. And I'd like to restructure the interpretive pattern that I see guiding his theology. It's not so much that Caliban first does something evil, and then, second, attributes that wickedness to his God. Instead, I think what's happening here is something more like Caliban notices something broken in the order of things, whether that be the randomness of crab deaths or his enslaved situation. And then two, Caliban acts out the possible causes of these broken effects, trying on different answers to explain what most critics, including Loisberg, read as Darwinian nature and what I see as theodicy, the problem of evil. Finally, three, he uses the optional conclusions of those experiments to work out the possibilities of his enslaved situation. So, the poem not only raises moral concerns about religious schema that dominated the Victorian age, it also situates these potentially abstract questions about the goodness of God and about the justice of Christian soteriologies within the very specific context of slavery and imperialism. And here I should underscore that it was published in 1864 in the thick of the American Civil War and right after Darwin publishes On the Origin of Species. But while Loisberg finds in the poem a set of two responses to Caliban's enslavement, for Loisberg, Caliban can either accept his position in the imperial hierarchy as natural, or he can resist his oppressors. I want to explore a wider range of options for this ostensibly rough, yet sophisticated thinker by turning our attention to different questions I think the poem is taking on. How do people practice religion? How do they experience spirituality in a state of enforced suffering? Or perhaps even more specifically, what theological and spiritual options are available to enslaved people? So while this is a poem that doubles down on the racist pseudoscience of Victorian social Darwinism, it also figures Caliban's immaturity as an asset. I want to argue that this positionality offers us something in our efforts to think about religion beyond just the question of belief. Here, we see Caliban engaging in a theological exploration, but it's impossible to read this text as merely a cerebral exercise. That's what I'm going to argue. While many other critics have noted Caliban's characterization as something like a wayward Victorian boy, almost all of them have continued to read the poem's theology and its religiosity interchangeably. In other words, most people, when we think about religion in the poem, we're thinking only about theology. And theology is only one aspect of religion. One of the core questions I want to raise here is, what do we miss if we reduce religion to just belief? In this case, we miss the forms of embodied knowledge Caliban practices. We miss his engagement with the natural world. And as I'll mostly be elaborating here, we miss his playfulness, all three of which are inextricably dependent on his characterization as an immature being. By recognizing Caliban's theological enterprise as an embodied experiment in iterative play, we can move our discussions of Victorian religiosity beyond tired faith versus doubt paradigms. And much more importantly, in this case, we can bring the insights of post-secular studies to the urgent effort to integrate consciousness of race and coloniality into our critical practice. I'll articulate the rest of this argument through 3 points. First, I'll analyze Caliban's positionality as an enslaved and immature theologian. Then I'll examine the forms of religiosity that positionality enables. I will argue that Caliban's characterization as a figure of arrested development determines his experience of religious play, and that play, in fact, provides him with a fuller embodied religious experience than the questions of whether to accept or reject his faith. Finally, I'll make some very, very brief observations to close on what Caliban's playfulness can help us understand about the relationship between religion and literary studies as I see it today. Okay. Playfully titled, Caliban the Teenage Theologian. One of the unique features of this poem is that it undertakes serious theological discovery through someone quite like a teenager. Browning never gives any hint of Caliban's age, but scholars have long read him as immature in a variety of senses, partially because of tone. His tone evokes a resentful boy. He enacts several hallmarks of what will come to be known half a century later as adolescence. He takes care to distinguish his thoughts and values from his mother. He rebels against authority, poking fun at his captors, at least as much as he actively resists them. He purposely gets himself into trouble, even though he knows he shouldn't. During this speech, he is literally playing in the mud. This characterization of Caliban as something like a young troublemaker comes with insidious implications. Post-colonial critics have long understood Shakespeare's Caliban as an enslaved figure, and that characterization brings with it the cultural assumptions about Caliban's race. In the 19th century, many apologists for chattel slavery justified their position by appealing to race science that held non-white people, including all people of color, as well as Irish and those of other ethnic groups, as examples of lower evolutionary forms, biologically and socially immature. As Kenan Malik argues in his book, The Meaning of Race, and it's long, so I've given you all of it. The new science, and by new here he means new for Victorians, the new science established the idea of an evolutionary ladder running from inanimate matter through lowly forms of life to humanity itself. Nature had evolved by gradual means from the most backward types to the highest forms. Primitive people were seen as the link between European civilization and primates. This outlook was encouraged by the anthropological view that contemporary backward societies represented human beings arrested at an earlier stage of evolution. Victorian social evolutionism thus rejected the Enlightenment idea that there was a unilinear sequence of social or intellectual stages and that all humanity could reach the highest stage. For the Victorians, different groups had diverged, stopped, or regressed along the evolutionary path according to their racial capacities. One comparison I'd like to draw out here is that for social Darwinists, the naturalization of inequality, the process of explaining the social phenomena of inequality with the language and logics of biology, provided something like providence. Even as scientists and theologians debated whether Darwin's new theory of evolution really, quote, dealt the death blow to design-based thinking. Even as scientists and theologians debated whether Darwin's new theory of evolution really dealt the death blow to design-based thinking, like natural theology, to use Thomas Henry Huxley's terms. Emerging social scientists like Herbert Spencer, although he is by no means the sole perpetrator, embraced a different kind of telos by imagining themselves as the inheritors of progress, with different groups diverged, stopped, or regressed along the evolutionary path, something like evolutionary children. Literary critics have been quick to note these associations. As early as the 1960s, John Howard and Michael Timko interpreted Caliban as the, quote, missing link Darwin imagined between humans and primates, directly correlating his supposedly primitive nature with his supposedly immature theologizing. Similarly, without endorsing the characterization, Edward Bordeaux calls him, quote, a half-human slave of degenerate consciousness. And Stuart Peterfoy identifies him as, quote, a relic of the lower orders, whether those orders are construed as biological or social manifestations. So to put this somewhat crudely, Browning's version of Caliban is characterized in tone as something like a teenager, and that characterization is drawn, at least in part, large part, from how Victorian intellectuals encoded the racist logics of early evolutionary biology into their cultural understandings of other people. This is one way that critics have not just historicized the racial logic of 19th century social Darwinism, but replicated it in how we analyze our texts. I agree that Caliban is a figure characterized by immaturity, but I want our understanding of what that immaturity means and how it operates to get much more precise by exploring the religious potential of that undevelopment. One way to do that is to look at Caliban's spirituality itself in process and unformed. The text showcases Caliban working out his beliefs rather than declaring them, even if this were a poem about mere theology, which I'm arguing is not, or not entirely. That theology could hardly be considered settled. If there is a point at which Caliban matures into a firm theological position, it doesn't happen during this speech. What we are looking at then is not merely a missing link figure stumbling through sloppy theology. Instead, I read Caliban as an embodied thinker who uses playfulness to tackle some of the thorniest theological questions that emerged as a result of Victorian evolutionary discourse. In other words, Caliban is a figure of arrested development, both in characterization, his behavior looks like an adolescence, and in context. Victorians would have understood him as biologically and socially immature. Given this positionality and what Caliban does with it, which is to engage in a unique form of religious experimentation, play becomes, in this poem, an experimental theological tool. If we understand how that tool works and what it does for Caliban, we can think more carefully about religious experience beyond forcing Victorian religiosity into an oversimplified narrative of religious decline. Excuse me. Okay, play. Religious play. Okay, playfulness, which we sometimes call the ludicmos, does not usually appear in discussions of the 19th century religious landscape. Perhaps because we so consistently imagine Victorian religion as embattled, association with play might seem threatening. Why embrace play when we are so insistent on taking religion seriously? And yet, as those who think carefully about play know, it is a serious business. Play can contribute powerfully to our thinking about religion. In fact, it may be that one reason we practice religion is that we are animals who play. Here I am drawing on Robert Bella's work, Religion and Human Evolution, which argues that play is, quote, critically important for understanding the origin of religion. And furthermore, that one reason we humans produce religion is the extended period of adolescence distinct to mammals, which allows for imaginative play. Here's Bella. Quote, parental care among mammals, by which he means an extended period of childhood relative to other species, we take longer to grow up, has created a kind of relaxed selection from its very beginning, in sheltering newborns from direct selective pressures, and here me means natural selection, natural selective pressures, and leading to a childhood free enough to create intricate and innovative forms of play. For Bella, ritual is the primordial form of serious play in human evolutionary history, and he extends that ritual into his understanding of how and why humans evolved religion as practice, not merely as theory or theology. For my work then, play is a tool we can use to move our thinking beyond about religion beyond the question of belief. In this context, play can operate as an integral component of the religious process every bit as important to the spiritual experience in the poem as the theological inductions Caliban makes. There's a lot that's playful about this poem. Caliban's experiments with his pumpkins and his hermit crabs suit a traditional understanding of play. They produce no useful labor, they're spontaneous, they're low stakes, and they allow him to practice scenarios that would, outside the boundaries of this mid-afternoon break, come with far more severe consequences. In Bella's terms, we could understand a monologue as, quote, a kind of event, an activity that begins and ends, and it takes place in the context of daily life from which it is to some degree differentiated. So play is part of daily life, but it's marked as special in some way. This play is also thoroughly embodied. We could look at Caliban's posture, and here I'm quoting from the poem, flat on his belly in the pit's much mire, with elbows wide, fists clenched to prop his chin, kicking both feet. And he's laughing whilst lizards skitter about his body. Or we could focus on his mischief. Like antithetical worship, this play is birthed through Caliban's speech. It is good to cheat the pair and jibe, he says. Here, Caliban links the resistance of taking back his time and cheating Miranda and Prospero out of their stolen labor with jibing or joking. Thus, the potential resistance Losberg locates in the poem hinges on Caliban's playfulness. And that playfulness is physical. He even literally dresses up as Prospero, it's my favorite part of the poem, acting out the circumstances of his life with costumes and creatures and props. This is from his speech, playing thus at being prosper in a way, taketh his mirth with make-believes. If the poem does interrogate belief, it does so in strikingly physical, mischievous, experimental, repetitive, low-stakes ways. Okay. So here it is probably appropriate to wonder what I mean by play. This is an inherently interdisciplinary subject, drawing insights from anthropology, psychology, child rearing, among other discourses. And if we were after a full survey of what play is and how it works, we would need to turn variously to experts in all of those fields. For now, let me point out that if play is an interdisciplinary concept, it is not an ahistorical one, and it was being theorized actively over the course of the 19th century. In fact, it was being theorized actively over the course of the 19th century by the same thinkers who were theorizing evolutionary adolescence. In 1795, Friedrich Schiller argued that surplus energy allows us to play. Quote, people, like other species, play when they feel themselves satisfied with their standing in the world, and thus capable of expressing their most spirited selves. By the mid-19th century, play was integrated with the same racial theories I just outlined, at least in part in the work of Herbert Spencer. In his 1855 treatise, Principles of Psychology, Spencer hones Schiller's theory, echoing the idea that creatures play when their basic needs are met, which allows them to, quote, ponder and actuate the ideal. But Spencer also brings his focus on societal evolution to bear on his theories of play. Quote, more complex and advanced societies, as he sees it, shift interaction from selfish, sensory, and sometimes destructive engagements, like Caliban's, to those that are more sublimated and aesthetic. I should pause here and also mention that what we think of when we think of social Darwinism or an explanation for the inherent competitiveness or danger of the world doesn't come from Darwin. It mostly comes from Herbert Spencer. So this figure is a kind of central locus point for both thinking about who's interested in play over the 19th century and also who's encoding those racial logics that have been described. So I'm looking forward to settling on the theories of play that most resonate in the poem, but for now, let me just kind of create an amalgamation and identify the features of play that I'm most interested in among these definitions. Firstly, play is iterative behavior. That is, repetition is important and that repetition has a purpose. Secondly, it has to be distinct from labor. Thirdly, it offers the person playing a low-stakes arena in which to practice social skills, try on new ideas, and, not unlike literature, imagine the world otherwise. Finally, it's acted out in some way. In other words, there's a distinction between creative play and creativity that happens just inside one's head, which we might call the imagination or even imaginative work. This element of play is, I hope to show, key to understanding Caliban's embodied theology. For brevity's sake, I want to isolate just one section in which Caliban's play deploys the reasoning of natural theology and explore how it moves beyond belief by creating theology out of playful experience rather than analogy. And that's directly after the moment when Caliban narrates dressing up as Prospero. So he's in costume, he's been pretending to be Prospero. These are lines 188 to 203, in which Caliban speaks of himself in the third person. Tasteth himself no finer good in the world, when all goes right in this safe summertime. And he wants little, hungers, aches not much, then trying what to do with wit and strength. Falls to make something, piled yon pile of turfs, and squared and stuck there squares of soft white chalk, and with a fish tooth scratched a moon on each, and set up endwise certain spikes of tree, and crowned the whole with a sloth's skull atop, found dead in the woods, too hard for one to kill. All right, I'll just pause here. So he's kind of making a sandcastle, and the sandcastle sort of replicates the structure of a little kind of colonial ibis. Okay. No use at all in the work for the work's sole sake. Shall someday knock it down again. So there's again that analogy logic. Saith he is terrible. Watch his feats in proof. One hurricane will spoil 6 months' good hope. He hath a spite against me, that I know, just as he favors Prosper, who knows why. In these lines, we might recognize the echo of Spencer's definition of play as surplus energy. In Spencer's view, Caliban would only be able to engage in these experiments because he wants little, hungers, aches not much. That he spontaneously falls to make something in the safe summertime reinforces that this rare moment of time offers him a low-stakes forum in which to literally play out his ideas, while also hinting, with his allusion to the hurricane, that the stakes of such playing are ultimately quite serious. This is what Alison Gopnik, in her theorization of children's play, calls the paradoxically useful uselessness of immaturity unique to children's play. Crucially, these lines emphasize the sense experience of religious play. Caliban denies his tastes, wants, hungers, and aches, but the effect is to remind us that he is a creature who thirsts and hungers, whose big ideas, as we'll see, cannot be safely cordoned into the sphere of theology. Here, as elsewhere, Caliban's embodiment and epistemology are inextricable. His knowledge of the world system around him is built from his playful sensory experience. If, following the hermeneutic rhetoric of natural theology, Caliban is forming an interpretation of the world, his interpretation process cannot be understood as observation plus analysis. Or in other words, his theological interpretations are not born out of a cognitive act of analogy. Instead, they emerge from these playful exercises lived in the world. To draw again here briefly from Robert Bella, the practice is prior to the belief. Belief is best understood as an expression of practice. Okay. What kinds of beliefs then does this practice of play engender? What is the use of this usefulness? One payoff of what I've called religious play is that it may open up what we mean by natural theology anyway, by creating other avenues for theological speculation about providence. In these final 2 lines, we've got to understand Caliban as asking urgent questions about God's will. Who knows why Setebos spites Caliban and blesses the prosperous Prospero? As an enslaved speaker seemingly not cared for by a loving God, he's justified in asking why any deity would allow him to exist in such violating circumstances. That who knows why is never answered, although perhaps the quiet knows. As far as Caliban is concerned, someone has ordered his life. There is a designer, but the corresponding will of that designer remains open. Questioning providence. may look like the crisis of faith we might expect from a post-Darwin poem concerned about the religious implications of natural selection. But just as Caliban's religious experience here cannot be cleanly identified as theology that happens in his mind and distinguished from his playful practices, so too, his invocation of providence cannot be distinguished from the natural discourses that shape his experience. Earlier, I pointed out that the racialized discourse of evolutionary biology, imported into sociology by social Darwinists like Herbert Spencer, relied on a kind of teleological thinking similar to providence. Both intellectual traditions reached toward a telos, white Anglican progress in the former case, God's design in the latter. By questioning providence and leaving that question hanging, Caliban undermines the race-related logic of naturalized racial categories and the telos that ends in the white, skeptical academic. A key component of British Victorian racialized thinking, as Malik shows, is its reliance on naturalized, physical, immutable distinctions between categories of people. But this poem doesn't respect any categories. On one hand, this is a figure having an issue of the self. Why has he landed where he is with Prospero where he is? On the other hand, the undeniable creatureliness of the poem, its presentation of a whole system of selves that Caliban plays with and plays as, offers him a way of decentering the self and thinking theologically about that. As many readers have observed, Caliban creates an understanding of himself through the crabs, the fish, the spiders, vegetables, sea beasts, and even Prospero. Note just in this brief example where the he of Caliban's third-person reference bleeds into the so-he of Setebos. If the selves cannot be cleanly distinguished, if Caliban can play Prospero, and Prospero is perhaps Setebos, and Caliban takes on the role of Setebos to the crabs and the creatures who are paradoxically also Caliban, then the whole system of naturalized difference, based either on selves, as we see in this passage, or on racialized types, as we've traced in the evolutionary biology of the period, begins to break down. So what looks like degeneration, Caliban's inability to distinguish between self and other, his immaturity, his rough speech, his play, in fact offers a way of conceiving the self that does not fall along the lines of 19th century racial hierarchies. Ultimately, I read this moment as a way of imagining a providence where providence isn't about a single subject. Part of the point might be that there are options for people who are suffering, options beyond the reasoning that God must be evil or that nature must be cruel. So, Caliban engages in play, at the same time as he considers his big questions about theodicy. But it's not just that play and spiritual questions happen simultaneously. His theological ruminations are engendered only by this His theological ruminations are engendered only by this playfully, immaturely embodied experience with the natural world. My argument here is that his theological expressions cannot be distinguished from his playful activities. Put differently, the religiosity of the poem is produced by the interplay, if you will forgive my pun, of his epistemic and ludic expressions. Okay, I'd like to close with just a few reflections on how we read a poem like this. I've argued here that Browning's poem leans into its characterization of Caliban as a figure of spiritual adolescence, to articulate a religiosity that goes beyond theology. Through play, Caliban articulates a natural theology that does, to echo Loisberg, suit the circumstances of his life. These circumstances also demonstrate the real stakes to Caliban's play, while the poem presents Caliban's rare break here as an escape from forced labor. This is not escapism we're dealing with. If low-stakes, playful, embodied creativity enables Caliban's critique, it also helps him to develop alternative relations to the other selves in the poem, ultimately attending to the embodied and playful dimensions of religiosity in the poem, including but also exceeding its theology. We can imagine that Caliban's experience of suffering is suffering and can be creative. I take it here what might be called a reparative approach to the religious dimensions of Caliban upon Setebos, and it results in a reparative understanding of Caliban's immaturity. I'm aware of the intellectual and ethical risks of that position, particularly given that this is a text composed by a white poet. But my interests here are balanced between recovery and critique. If we understand Caliban as merely a racist caricature of misguided faith, meant to either parody natural theologians or quarantine Browning's doubts within the scope of the poem, then we miss the additional dimensions of religiosity that shape Caliban's world. By attending to the many ways religion operates, as a belief, yes, but also as community, as embodied experience, we can imagine a fuller range of epistemic, social, and spiritual options for Caliban and for the people he represents. Thank you.